So we end up with the last portion of the course, and we're going to talk about global ecology and conservation, basically looking at a macro perspective of the world. And I've got bad news for you. It is not a good story. We're going to talk about different ways of, and you've heard of conservation before. You understand that the world is changing due to human activity. We're going to talk about how we can minimize that impact. Because we can't negate it, we can't turn back the clock. But we can try to minimize impact. So we're going to start off with talking about what is biodiversity and why is it important. So there are more than 1.8 million named species. That means people have gone around, found and cataloged lots and lots and lots, 1.8 million different types of species out there. Of those, you'll notice a great number of them, you'll see what people are interested in, right? Vertebrates, we care a lot about. There's a small sliver, but we got a lot of beetles, not just invertebrates. We're talking about a lot of insects, lots of different plants. We've only really focused in on a small number of, vertebrates only make up a small amount of this, of the named species. That being said, 1.8 million is what we've named. It's estimated there are between 5 million and 100 million species on the planet. We just haven't recognized them yet as their own. We may have seen them. We just don't recognize them as their own unique species yet. So at the low end count, that's more than twice the number of species that humans have named over our entire civilization. So there's a lot of different species out there, a lot of diversity. Most of that diversity, most of the different species are going to live in the tropics. And part of that reason is because in the tropics you have a lot of energy coming in from the sun. So you get most of your diversity in a tropical region. As you move outside of the tropics, you get less and less and less diversity as you move toward the poles. There's less and less and less energy, less niches for these organisms to evolve in. Right now, the tropics are undergoing heavy disturbances. Now, these are man-made disturbances. We're moving from heavily forested rainforest to lands for cattle grazing. It's being burned, it's being chopped, it's being taken down. Now, we just learned in the last lecture about disturbances. Over time, those will come back if they're allowed to, but right now they're being carefully managed in order to keep diversity extraordinarily low. You have 1 or 2 types of crops growing on this field, hundreds and hundreds of different species, or thousands or millions of species in this forest. So you're losing a lot of unique species. That leads to what's called conservation biology. Conservation biology is an integrative field. That is, it's not just biology, it's also genetics, it's ecology, physiology, molecular biology, geology, chemistry, epidemiology, looking at different diseases, all working together in order to understand how we can minimize the loss of biodiversity. There are 3 levels of biodiversity, and I guarantee you got a big question coming up that's going to ask you about the levels of biodiversity. This is where you're going to look. 3 levels of biodiversity. We've got genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. We'll go through each. With genetic diversity, what you're looking at is the genetic variation within a population and between populations. That is, what type of alleles are out there? How are these within a single group, how different are the organisms? You guys know what this fruit is up here? It's a kiwi, right? Just with the normal in the center, you see the store-bought kiwi. But as you move away, you see all this variation, all the way down to like the kiwi berries. It's not just it's one species with lots and lots and lots of variation. What that variation allows this population to do is if there is a selection event, like population bottlenecking, which we talked about at the beginning of the semester, you're going to have some alleles that will allow the species to continue. If you lost all of the diversity, except for that thing that we buy at the store, if you have a selection event that wipes that one out but would have allowed these smaller orange ones to survive, you lose the species. It's important to maintain genetic diversity so that these species can rebound, can come back after an event. We have ecosystem diversity. Ecosystem diversity is not dealing with the individual, it's dealing with the environment around it. Typically, ecosystems are going to be based on average temperature and average rainfall. And if we plot this out, you're going to see low temperature and low rainfall gives you a region called the tundra. It's super cold, but may not have, it's cold with low levels of precipitation. If it's cold with high levels of precipitation, well, honestly, that doesn't happen much because of the way we talked about with the wind patterns. As you increase temperature but keep annual rainfall low, you see deserts at the bottom. I'm sorry, so you increase temperature but keep rainfall low, you've got deserts. As you increase precipitation, you're going to see more and more and more life. So we get increasing temperatures, increasing precipitation, lead to increasing diversity. Now, many species depend on the difference between ecosystems for survival. Most species don't live just in the tundra or just in the grasslands. They live on the edge, between two biomes, between two ecosystems. Whenever you change the environment, you get death. Anytime there's a change to the environment, organisms will die. Those organisms that live in that environment, some will adapt. Thus, we need the the genetic diversity, but many will die. What you're looking at here is bleached coral. 15 years ago, this coral was brightly colored, surviving just fine. Now it's all white and gray, all dead. Because small changes in its environment have led to major impacts on the organisms that live there. As the coral dies, so do the organisms that rely on the coral. So we talked about genetic diversity, we've talked about ecosystem diversity. I don't think did we talk about species diversity? Species diversity is just all of the different species that are present. All of the 180 million names, 1.8 million named species, and 5 million to 100 million unnamed species. Biodiversity is important though. Why? Let's be honest, for us, we need to exploit it. Threatened species can be exploited for medications or unique genes that help humanity. We are actively hunting different genes that can do different things to improve humans. We are also finding medications. There was a frog in the Amazon that produces its own painkiller that's 100 times more powerful than morphine. By understanding its structure, the chemical structure that we found from this frog, we've been able to improve our processes for making pain medication. We can exploit them. So if nothing else, you keep biodiversity around in order to mine it for money. Speaking of money, ecosystem services. Plants and animals do a lot to purify the air and purify the environment. They detoxify and decompose waste. They pollinate crops. They preserve soil. Without the organisms that do this, we would have to do it manually. Manually making all of these adjustments, manually purifying the air. You can do it. And you guys have an air purifier in your house? It's possible. You can purify the air, but it requires energy. It requires space. And a plant can do it way more efficiently. If we were to take on the role that these plants do, or insects, let's talk about bees. Bees are going extinct. You're seeing less and less bees around your house, probably more wasps, but less bees. Their job is to pollinate flowers, basically, like the ones that we use to make vegetables. Without bees, we'd have to manually pollinate those flowers in order to get food. It's been estimated that it will cost $33 trillion per year to do these ecological services that are provided for free right now by plants and animals. If you lose your ecosystem diversity, if you lose that biodiversity, you lose this, this service that they provide. There are a lot of threats to biodiversity. Habitat loss, introduced species, we talked about invasive species before, overharvesting, and global climate change. All of these will impact the biodiversity of a region. So we have this field called conservation. Conservation is where you're trying to maintain biodiversity by focusing on population size, what's sustainable, on genetic diversity, making sure that the organisms you have a wide variety of alleles, and making sure to protect what are called critical habitats. So you're not trying to save everything. You cannot save everything. You're trying to maximize the impact you have. The most threatened individuals are going to be those with small populations. They are very, very vulnerable to habitat loss, much more so than large populations. If you have a small population and it loses the small area, like we talked about the hogsucker, it lives in that 2-mile radius. If suddenly that 2-mile radius was completely dammed off, all of them would die and they would not exist anywhere else in the world. It's a small population that thrives in a small region, so if you lose that region, the whole population dies off. That would be a region that you would want to protect. As populations decrease in size, they end up losing genetic diversity. This is called population bottlenecking, what we covered at the beginning of the semester. And that makes them more vulnerable to selective pressures. You no longer have the ability to pass beneficial alleles on to the next generation if your population is so small that those beneficial alleles, just by happenstance, by random chance, have been eliminated. So by having high genetic diversity, you can overcome small population size. But if you have low genetic diversity and low population size, you're sunk. You're teetering on the edge of extinction. It takes a very short amount of time to lose genetic variation and a long time to recover it. And that gets us to what are known as endangered species. And there's a big difference between an endangered species and a rare species. An endangered species is on the verge of disappearing. A rare species is living in balance with the world around it and is not terribly in danger. An endangered species is not viable in its population, whereas a rare species is viable. It will survive. Every species has a minimum value to its population size, and that's different among different organisms. If you have a high population size, you've got a low chance of extinction. As you start to lose population size, your chance of extinction go up higher and higher. So that just makes sense, right? And that's basically what you're talking about when we talk about extinction. What you find is some organisms need a larger group of organisms around them to mate with, to keep that biodiversity high. So they're going to be on this upper end, sort of the top level of this curve. Some species require a smaller population, so they're going to be on the bottom end. Not all species require the same population size to be viable. What we look at with conservation is how do we manage that population? How do we keep them at a stable population size? An example of a rare species might be a top-tier predator. In the oceans, the great white shark is the top-tier predator. Have you guys ever seen, you've probably seen video of a great white shark, right? Yeah, they're massive and terrifying. When you think about a great white shark, I want you to really understand its size, because it's hard to conceptualize it when you're looking at it on TV. So let's see, these are 1, 2, 3, 4. From the window to here is about the size of a male. From the window to here is upper end, right? That's a big fish. And it is designed for eating whales and you know, other mammals. But just so you know, that's the sizes we're talking about here. These are top tier predators. They are rare. The environment can't support a fish that size, too many fish that size. You don't see them congregating much. They only meet up with each other to mate, really. So they're going to be rarer than those organisms lower down on the trophic scale. The fish they eat, there are going to be a lot more of them. Oh, fun story. Sharks. You guys know most shark attacks happen in waist-deep water? And we're not talking small sharks either. We're talking, you know, probably smaller than the great white, from the window to about here in waist-deep water. Yeah, right? That's fun. Enjoy the ocean. I'm scared of it. So we have all of these, you know, there's all these benefits to keeping these species alive, to keeping biodiversity. So we need these other organisms, but at the same point, it costs money and resources to protect those organisms. For every forest that we save, that's one less place that people can live, and people need space to live or else they can't survive. So we have conflicting demands. How do you balance human needs versus biodiversity needs? And that's hard to do. You're not going to win the fight of protect everything. So you have to find those areas that are most critical to protecting biodiversity and focus in on them. As I mentioned before, most organisms live on the edge. They live right where two biomes begin to interact, right where two landscapes interact, at the edges of things. Here you see a forest and a meadow. There are going to be a lot of organisms living right along that line because they can exploit both biomes. They can get food from the prairie or from the forest. Does that make sense? You see a lot of organisms living right along a river because they're going to exploit both the forest and the river for food. Those boundaries define our landscapes, and they're going to help us define where biodiversity can be best conserved. Area with lots of boundaries, an area with lots of edges, is going to be one that maintains a high level of biodiversity. Simply because organisms can gather resources from multiple areas. When humans make alterations, they create new edges, you lose biodiversity. Does that make sense? Once you've removed some of those areas, you've created a new edge. You've pushed the creatures that were living in the original edge out. They're dead now. The organisms that were farther into the region are now on the edge, and they're not adapted to that. Oftentimes, as we build, we fragment populations. We break them into smaller and smaller pieces. Fragmentation leads to less genetic diversity because now these organisms can't interbreed with a whole population. They're much smaller groups.